Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Your Christmas present this year is us doing a couple live podcasts before the end of the year.
Is there a receipt?
If that's your Christmas present.
Is there a receipt? Yes, this is non-returnable.
Yeah. Can I take it back? Right.
Yeah. Oh, you shouldn't have.
The gift receipt is what you're talking about, right? Yeah.
Yes, this is
How
often
always get the gift receipt.
What is the percentage of gifts that you get that you really don't care for that you would return now in our ages now?
Oh,
I think it gets much harder.
Or when
yes,
I was a child?
no,
when
now.
I was a child, when I didn't have the choice, all of them.
Oh, no.
Literally all of them.
Well, all the ones you wanted to return?
I shouldn't say that. I can't believe I'm airing this, but this is fun. Growing up, my older brother always got the cool clothes. So every time the clothing was provided by a certain parent, I always knew I was going to get shortchanged. I always had the stuff that I never liked, and I always liked my older brother's stuff. There is no gift receipt for secondhand or wherever we pulled it from. It's just like, I'm out again.
Oh, goodness.
Anyway, wow, what a tangent.
That's a double
whammy. And happy Tuesday to you, gentlemen.
Yes, it is.
I knew my transition from being a kid to no longer be having the kids' gifts is when the first gift I opened was a flashlight that could break windows for my father.
There you go.
And I was like, "Oh wow!" He's like, "And if you ever fall on over a bridge, you can."
And
break,
thus started my life of crime.
And life was never the same in the banks. Okay.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's when we knew that the T-Rexes were over.
Oh yeah,
that's funny. Pretty good. I don't think I have any funny Christmas things around that one.
No. Do you gift receipt?
We do.
I always do.
We do. In the time that we've been not live, I guess we did a couple of recordings here last week. People were traveling, couldn't be around. But in that time, we actually got a release from Power BI Desktop in that period of time. So the December 2022 release just recently came out, and was just kind of curious your guys' thoughts on what came out, anything that stick out to you. And again, it's December, it's the end of the year. There's not a whole lot going on. People are kind of ramping down for Christmas anyway, so I get that the update isn't quite as large as it used to be. Any thoughts that kind of stood out to you?
The ones I think I pushed onto my team right away were the comparison calculations in DAX that were added.
The offset and window?
Index offset window.
Mm-hmm. How's that working for you?
Well, I just told them about them. It's not like we automatically implemented.
Your performance is
test it out, guys. Like, figure it out. Yeah. Because I think there are several areas that we were doing those types of comparisons that we just had to move back into views in SQL to perform those before pushing those in the model. So depending on performance, it's like one of those things that we'll have to validate and test out and see how it performs in the model. But excited to see those because there's a lot of things that we do comparing positionally depending on what data is in there.
How did I do compared to last month? Looking at numbers up or down. Yeah, makes total sense. Anything, Tommy, that stood out to you for the update?
I mean, I would say that those 3 DAX calculations are a bombshell because there's never been anything. There's no DAX calculations like this. This is in its own category. What this potentially can be for the future, that it's visual based. I don't know how this works from the model base because it has nothing. Does it have anything to do with the tabular model then?
What do you mean?
So since everything's based on the current context of the visual, right? Not the context of the model or the filter context. I don't know if filter context necessarily exists because it's solely based on the visual.
It still exists. It's just a matter of you have to do a lot of extra. So I think it's a matter of efficiency, right? If you have 1 million rows per month and you order the resultant query,
right,
by sequential months or something like that, right? If you can get a query that can output that data, there's no reason to go back and have to calculate all that information over again. If you want to just do a difference between the prior year or percent change or something like that, it makes a lot more sense to create a result, and then from that result, then do the difference calculation on a much smaller data set. I think it's purely a performance standpoint here.
All I know is I think this introduction is huge for those who've been in DAX for a long time, because there's never been anything that's been a visual solely focused on the visual itself in terms of what DAX can compute. You put this in a table, you put this in a tree map, I guess is sorted based on
I mean, true to form, Greggy is
Sure.
everybody and saying it's been around. It's probably
course,
just not
of course,
been as easy, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So
I think that's the right place to go with that.
They're absolutely part of the DAX engine, right?
Yeah.
But like where specifically, I don't know. But at the same time, this plus quality of life improvements around simplifying some of the DAX that you could generate these, outputs with, I think has been a pretty main focus this last year, because we've seen some significant improvements in simplifying things that you could do. It just took forever and a day to do it.
Yeah. I think that's where a lot of you're going to get your advantage here. I think as you continually see more and more people joining in the DAX party, getting involved, I think Microsoft's going to continually try to make it easier and easier for you to write your own calculations or build calculations for you. And some of these calculations could just be wrappers for other stuff that's happening. Anyways. So I think the one feature that is maybe needed or has been the most frustrating to me from a visual building standpoint is they finally have fixed the slicer type formatting. So now that has officially
put it on the properties pane.
Oh my gosh.
I know, right? It was like just one of those catalog things that you're like, oh yeah, it's not there, it's over here.
It's just not there. And I think it was extremely difficult to explain to people what it was doing, honestly. Like if you when you're teaching this and you're like, hey, here's a slicer. Oh, by the way, did you know you could change it? Everyone's like, ooh, cool. But it's really hard to figure out when it's changing, because you had to had the title had to be on, and you had to put your cursor where the icons were to make sure they could hover.
And don't use a dark background, because you can't change the color of the drop down.
Can't change the color.
So
yeah, I think it's much better that they've moved that feature away from the actual slicer pane. It's good, I think. Cool. Any other kind of things that you guys rolled across the internet and found that was interesting or relevant?
Not from a blog or article standpoint, but there are two conferences that are coming.
There are two conferences. So let's go through those. The Visualbased conference is happening this March in 2023, coming up this next year, March 14th to the 18th, and there'll be a Saturday that'll be a completely free event. If you want to go join that event, get a 5% off discount. You can use Power BI Tips 5 to get a 5% discount on your tickets to Visualbased. And Seth, what's the other conference?
The other one is the hosted by Radicat again, right? But it's the Power BI Summit, which is an all virtual. So as opposed to you needing to know about Visualbased right now and plan ahead, because there is a virtual option. But hey, who wouldn't want to travel
Gotta go
to Europe?
Yeah,
and especially maybe to see somebody we know. The virtual conference, Power BI Summit, is the couple weeks prior, March 6th through the 10th. And that's an all virtual one. So that one is the one where they do, I think they try to do like different time zones and run it, throughout the days. And I'll be a part of that one as well.
Nice.
We got people speaking. Tommy will meet you at Visualbased in the UK, and Seth will meet you online on the Power BI Summit virtual conference.
We're spreading the
Tommy's
news
actually
about the
putting in the real work.
Yeah, Tommy's doing the real work, traveling there.
Flying for 7 hours without kids. Yeah, that's the real work.
This is yeah.
Easy.
It's called vacation.
I get it now.
It's called vacation. Love it. Excellent. I think that kind of wraps up all of our announcements today. Today is the hotly debated topic. Do you build measure tables or do you build display folders inside your data models? I think this is going to be a good one. I just saw an article come out from Kurt, Data Goblins, talking about, I believe it was foldering, or maybe it was a tweet. I can't quite remember. Go see if I can pick up the
remember. Man, he's got some good stuff at Data Goblin.
Incredible.
While you go figure that out.
I'm gonna go Google that one. Where do you guys land? What do you guys feel?
I feel that there's a need to organize your DAX calculations better.
Than what it's right
So
now?
that's why we
Oh.
have a couple options that we're talking through. I guess before we get stuck into them, it is still surprising to me how obscure they are, right?
I mean, hard to find?
Or
Yeah,
hard to
as a
do.
general user just coming into it, it's not like a right click create a folder kind of experience or right click create a table, kind of it's just there are hidden ways in which you can help yourself organize things better.
Yeah.
And it's kind of surprising that they're not easier to find.
What's crazy is to your point that there's still both, like if you were at a magic trick doing a party where it's like, did you know how to create a measure table? It's a hack. And you basically, it just showcases like, ta-da. And the same thing with display folders hidden on only in the modeling ribbon. And you have to actually enter in the display folder. None of them are pre-built in, but I mean, essential to, I think, our ability to scale, our ability to organize for ourselves, and if we're working on a team.
Well, I mean, here's a good portion, right? Like, let's describe for the lay user what are these
Right.
two nebulous concepts, and what are we talking about? Display folders. If you never knew,
Yeah, let's go through that.
Organize your DAX. And maybe I'll tip my hand as far as like the preferred method or what I prefer, right? So one is only accessible in the modeling view, where initially you would select which measures or columns that you want to put into a, how do you guys describe this? A subfolder within your overall table, right? So if I have, for the sample data sets, the financials table, I can select a group of columns or measures that I've created. And when I select those, a display folder option comes out of nowhere. Like just boom, it's there. And then you can add your the name of the table, and then it automatically has this subfolder within each of the tables that you have. And then you can continue to add measures or any of the calculated columns, et cetera, or columns, right, to help organize what's going on in that table, right? And they're extremely helpful. You can have multiple. You can figure, like, especially with tables that are, which shouldn't be really wide and have a lot of columns, or potentially a lot of calculations, because depending on what those calculations are for, you if this is a base model, you could have calculations for specific reports or for visuals or for pages, and you want to organize that in a much better fashion as opposed to trying to do a prefix underscore or prefix dash on all of your measures, and it just becomes this extremely long list. So it's a great way to segment out your calculations. And the other way, Tommy,
The other way,
you just create your own table, right?
Create your own table, measure tables. So that speaking to the first with the hack is basically, if you, and anyone can try this now if you've never heard of this, enter data, no rows, one column, hide that column and add a measure there. And then the magic trick is basically collapsing your selection pane, bringing it back, and all of a sudden a new icon shows up for that table, which will always show up on the top and is basically just a measure table, is considered a measure table in the Power BI model.
Yep.
And all the measures that you add to there, again, everything will always show up on the top, which is a huge difference. You can have display folders there too. You can create multiple measure tables. And the difference between with the display folders that in a sense lives in a fact table, if you have sales, it's always be to the bottom unless you're hiding all the columns. It's always showing on the top with that particular icon. There used to be a limitation here where if you did Q&A in your dashboards, or if you had Q&A anywhere in your report, measures that did not live within the right fact table wouldn't
had a harder time
work.
finding the answers.
Right. And that was one of the best practices, to keep your measures in a measure table or measures in a fact table to make Q&A work. That's no longer a limitation. So it really is a preference at this point.
I think it is definitely a preference. I definitely feel like I lean towards the what is easiest for external users or new users of this model to consume? So I think from my standpoint, and also I want to point out here too, if you are building a measure table, you can do so in Power Query. You can also do so in DAX. One thing I have noticed that was quite interesting is if you delete a table in Power Query and you had measures in it, those measures become broken. They still live in your model, and you have no way of removing them. So
Wait, say that again.
What?
I think that's how I had ran into this recently. If you make a measure table or you had something in Power Query that had measures in it and you remove said table, those measures get stuck in your model, but you can't remove them.
What are they?
Oh, because you deleted the object that they
Yep.
lived in.
That they lived in. Now, I don't remember exactly how this scenario, I can't remember if it was I deleted a table in a thin report or not, or the model deleted a table, but I had a thin report with measures in it, and I had all these measures that were like warning broken, but I couldn't remove them, or there was some kind of issue or bug there. I can't remember exactly how it panned out.
So it becomes like Phantom of the model.
Well,
because I bet they yeah. Oh man, they
Where
get
do you-
orphaned.
like
right?
how do
So
you? Yeah,
it's probably
exactly.
still part of like the back end code, and it's
Yep.
referencing. It's
Something-
still referencing the table. So
a table that's
you
there.
deleted the object that it lived in, but
And then
that
you can't
delete
create a
didn't
measure with the
cascade
same name.
forward and grab the measures out of the
Yep.
model.
Right?
something
You
weird
wouldn't be
there.
you wouldn't be able to create a measure with the same name because that exists.
Correct. And that would, yeah. So another thing you can't do is you can't take two measures and make the same name twice, which makes total sense because then the model wouldn't have a clue how to calculate two different things. So I guess where I sit on some of these things, there's a couple user functionalities that I think I'd really like to see improved inside desktop. Seth, and I agree with you 100%. Seth, you made a really good point around, hey, you have measures in these columns or in measures that you're pushing in either a fact table or a folder, right? One of the things I really like the idea of right-clicking and making a folder. I think it's very difficult. And also if you're making folders, I don't think you can make folders inside the report view of the modeling window or the report view of the filter pane, field pane, I guess would be field pane. You have to go to the model view to create folders in desktop.
Not only that, you can't add any measures to the display folder when you create a new one. You still have to add it when you go back to the modeling view.
Yes, correct. So to me, so I would say 90% of my measure building work happens on the model view. That's where I do it. That's just where I model things. So to have that view not include the ability to create folders, and I have a pattern here that I think I would like to employ, but the desktop tool clearly does not do it. And it bugs me. One thing that we're talking about here is we're talking about measures in folders, but you can put columns also in folders. So Seth, you were talking earlier around a really wide table that has a whole bunch of columns in it. Okay, we don't really recommend having really wide tables just because that's a lot of extra data that you're throwing in your model that you may not need. However, I would really love the ability to have, again, I'm thinking through my workflow here. If I have a really wide table and I know there's a lot of columns I may or may not need, it'd be really nice to be able to put all those columns as I'm building the model or building out things. It'd be really nice to bring all those columns, put them in a folder called not used. And then as I build visuals, to drag those fields out of that folder and put them in the root part of the table, or put them in a different folder that is used, or categorize them when I use them. So that way I have like this, I kind of have this opinion of it'd be nice if everything was not used until it was, kind of thing.
Right.
And then I could build a pattern or a process around me just, as I build a model or as I build a report, pulling out the measures that I think I'm going to be using and then moving them over. That way I could come back and then it gives me a very clean method to go back and clean up the model.
There's a Tableau editor script right now that like the cleanup objects.
Go ahead, Tommy. Sorry.
But it basically cleans up everything. So if it's a DAX measure, puts it in a display folder, and if it's a column, puts it in a column. But the idea there too is what's frustrating with that is, again, not all those columns are necessarily necessary.
They're not all used.
Right.
I mean, again, this is part of like your data discovery work, right? I'm showing up to a model. that I'm going to just start building things on. I don't know what I need from the original tables. I haven't planned out every single visual to have every single column that I need. So I'm just probably initially in the report design, I'm bringing a lot of extra columns that I think I might need and then trying to use them and then get to a point where, okay, I didn't need everything. I only needed these 10 out of 25 columns. Great. Well, I'd like to hide those columns or put them away somewhere or delete them from the model to reduce model size. So it's like a cleanup activity that I'm trying to work into my actual build process. Seth, you had a sigh there earlier.
No, I do, because it's a good idea, right? It's a manual process, though, right? Like, how hard is it? Like, why can't we just have lineage in Power BI, right? Like, just show me a table that says, here's your list of calculations and how they, like, where they're used, right? Like come on.
Yep.
How it's not just the ease of, like, well, actually now I'm recalling the conversation. Well, because the more bloat we add to our models, the more space it takes, the more time I guess people stay in it.
Maybe I'm just dealing with cheapskates all the time, or maybe I'm a cheapskate. Like, I'm always trying to optimize my model and get it smaller.
Yeah.
Like, it's always trying to make it smaller all the time.
So one of the things, though, you were talking about, like, having to jump into the model view all the time.
Yes.
It wasn't long ago that they added in the DAX ribbon in there, right? So we can create our calculations in there now and easily add them to the display folder.
2 months ago.
For folders, right? So
Yes,
at least
correct.
there's not that popping back and forth between
100%.
the two screens and then having to manage things and then move around, etc. So that is a big quality of life improvement, right on top of me complaining about one. The other question I had is, are there I already know there are locations, right? Greg, you mentioned it earlier in the chat. Like, what things don't work when we do when we place some of these measures in certain areas, right? Because his point was, like, I think in Excel you can't drill through, or you don't have an option to do some things if you're using a measure table.
Yeah.
Is that the only thing, or, like, so is this quality of life improvement breaking other things that our models would reference? Like, within the Power BI ecosystem, we're fine, but is Excel, are there any other touch points in Excel that we have to be cognizant of?
I mean, I feel like it's more of, there may be, I don't know, I haven't done extensive testing on drill through with Excel using a measure table, so I'm not sure I could speak directly to that one. Yeah, I think Greg's talking specifically to that one. So Greg's mentioning the Excel pivot tables drill through is explicitly controlled by the parent table. So when you drill through on a measure, it needs to know what table that measure is in to drill through down into that detail. So that's the only thing that I'm aware of that's a limitation, by moving those measures away from the tables they're actually being calculated in to other tables.
So I actually was doing a demo, and I had to switch it because of that last week, where I was like, look, in the Excel, and you can drill through an Excel. Never mind, let's change something because of that very reason.
Okay.
We were seeing both. We were showing both measure tables or display folders.
Yeah.
And at that time, the model had it in the measure table. I think exporting data too, if you're doing the underlying data set. Don't quote me, but that would be a pretty big issue too.
I think, again, when there was no folders initially, I think I was much more on the fence around, let's build a measure table, let's be organized, let's put measures there. Now that I'm building more models for external users, and now that I feel like I think to the end user experience, it's much clearer to understand this calculation came from this fact table. And I think another part of this that to me helps the story here a little bit is, when you're building a star schema, whatever that may be, if you're building anything star schema, there is a clear table where the calculations come from, and there are tables where the calculations are being sliced or cut by the dimension tables, right? So when I start talking about facts and dimensions, the more star schema you look like in your model, the more sense it makes to put those calculations inside the fact table. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've seen models that have calculations that are in dimension tables and they just don't work right. Why won't this filter? Why won't this change? I click over here, and what happens is people are trying to cross calculate things across dimensions, right? I have this dimension table on the left side of my model, and I have another dimension on the right-hand side of the table, and I have a measure in my dimension table. Well, now the filter context won't go through the fact table to the other dimension table. To me, that's like a big miss. That's just, I'm really not a fan of having measures anywhere in the dimension tables. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I've definitely never been an apostle with this word, because I've switched sides quite a few times over the Power BI lifespan. Of definitely start with measure tables because the ease of it.
Yeah.
And then once Tableau Editor became a thing, and really having actually a workflow, there's nothing more frustrating.
I love the automation from there.
Yeah.
That's
not even
cool.
that I can actually create something within a display folder.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I cannot stand creating objects and then having to go back to the modeling view and put in the name where it's out of whack, especially when you're in a sense in a process, or if you have ADHD and you need to focus on one thing at a time. Then there's a few things. So that process was so frustrating. Tableau Editor becomes a widely used tool, and then external tools, display folders.
Yep.
I want to go back to measure tables, and I think there's part of the chat right now is really making a case for kind of the hybrid. I don't want to say hybrid because Greg Baldini will yell. But the idea of, I like to, from proximity, where the measures to me should always be on the top. Like especially even if you have multiple measure or fact tables, you're always going to use a measure. I don't have to scroll down to find my measures. The case right now being said on the chat, which again, this could be a hot take, is that everything in the fact table should be hidden. Every column should be hidden.
I would agree with that.
Right.
Yeah, I would, if you're doing, again, I would say this is where I think Greg Baldini is going to yell at us right now. So Greg, you can start yelling into the microphone or into the chat window as we speak. So
you're on mic 4.
I think it would, in my opinion, it would be best practice to try and hide everything in the fact table except the measures or the calculations, because that's really what a fact table is intended to do. That's the most purest form of like a star schema with facts and dimensions, right? There's a single table, all the calculations come from that table, and there's no dimensional needs at that table. To get to that level, though, to get down to that purest form of like a star schema where it's 100% just calculations and measures, sometimes you need dimensional level things at that fact table. And this is where I think Greg Baldini is potentially pointing to a little bit here, some of these junk dimensions, or there's some things here that, other things that may be around that fact level table. So again, I would say from my standpoint, like I'm going to try to design, to your point, Tommy, throw the measures in the table where they live. There will be measures that potentially need to span multiple tables. So like, for example, if you have 2 fact tables and you're trying to do a divide statement between one or the other, where does that calculation live, right? If you want to be that super purist level, right? If I have a calculation touches 2 fact tables, can you really get to that answer? I don't know. You just kind of make a judgment call and move with it.
I think what's interesting about the conversation, Tommy, you framed it in like you flip-flopped, right? Or you go back and forth. But I think it's evolution, right? Over time, we initially, you look at your model and you're like, man, I got measures everywhere. And then I think we had the ability to create a separate table. And it's like, we figured out, like this is the best thing since sliced bread. I can remove all of these calculations and put them in this object that lives at the top. I was going to make a point here. I think during that evolution, though, a key point here that was commented in the chat is when you create measures, one of the things I never did when I started was actually hide columns. And if we're talking about developing a model, and I think the distinction here is like utilizing these objects for models that you're going to be sharing. Right. Like this isn't like if you were just the dude, just build it, or woman, the person building a Power BI report.
Yes.
And you're just, everything you do is yours and you don't have to worry about that. I would still argue, and we have another podcast to build for other people, but then it matters less. Right.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you get into habit of good organization of your models, then you don't have any work to do when you actually need to share it, because there's going to come a point in time where people need access. You're going to have some business unit that you built a report for. somebody else is going to look at the model, or hey, your
Correct.
team expands and somebody else needs to support it. So I think they're like within there, those practice of like, hey, hide the columns. We don't use columns anymore. We have calculations for them, whether they live in, a measure table or a display folder within the table. That's always a good practice to do, to do that so people aren't utilizing those columns. I think where I'm landing, right? When I started the conversation, I was like, display folders, 100%. Like that's where I like things now. I think we even had some issues where when the measure didn't exist in the fact table. I think there's an argument for both. I think we just create both right off the top of, as well. Let me ask this. Do we just create both? Like maybe that's part of the build process is I'm going to have some measures that are maybe generic in nature or may not necessarily live specifically in a fact table. Or I want to, create a set of measures for a particular group that I don't want underneath the fact table and display folder. And then I have display folders where I do have measures. Does that create confusion? Or do you guys say this is a one or the other choice?
My only issue, I like the idea of that, but my only issue with that is if you are not hiding all the columns in your fact table, the precedent shows that general measure table is always on the top. And for me, this kind of goes back to a efficiency point of thing where the more tables in your measure, or if you're building, I don't have to scroll down. Honestly, I don't want to have to try to find my main measures, like the total sales that have to do with the fact table, because I'm working on the report view, because now I have to scroll and find it. Whereas these general measure tables, these general measures in the measure tables always has the precedent on the top. I don't know if that's making too much sense, but from how I'm,
It's an ordering standpoint. Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think where again, to add on to your comment there, Tommy, if you're using a measure table, a couple things, I don't really love using measure tables anymore. I think I've kind of moved away from that. I think it's clearer to end users to consume the measure where it makes the most sense. I'm getting more towards, I'm doing more work prior to Power BI to make a star schema model. And because I'm getting closer to that, I feel like I'm trying to use the tool a bit differently, where I'm making folders and putting measures in those folders and using those in fact tables. Because again, to your point, Tommy, I don't need like 3 fact tables and then another table that describes a whole bunch of other calculations. Like that, to me, it's just an extra table, and it adds more weight to me scrolling in the filter pane, in the field pane. On the other hand, on the side there.
Because it goes about the logic, right? It's with the display folders, and you would do this in measure tables too. You wouldn't just have every single measure in one table without organization. If you had time intelligence, you probably want that.
Totally. Yes. And if you do have one large table, make multiple folders, right? Make folders in that single table that describe those measures.
Which you can also do a lot easier because you have to actually write out the backslash in Power BI desktop, but you can have nested folders too. I think utilizing all those things, I think there is a need though too, going back to the analyze in Excel, if that's the one limitation. And I think there's a few others that we're not necessarily mentioning here. And I think exporting underlying data is one of them. But again, don't quote me. If our model doesn't have some of those basic features, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice for the sake of just having something prominently displayed on the top. I think honestly, the beginning of this conversation, I was saying I'm going to convert back to measure tables. Based on the chat and honestly, based on the discussion with you guys, I don't think it has enough juice to be worth the squeeze, so to speak, to use a very common phrase. But I don't know if it's worth the actual optimization, if that's really the right word. Measure tables.
I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Seth? I'm not sure if I follow. I mean, again, this is all semantics. I think this is just organization for the end user, right? What makes most sense to them? The most times I've struggled with models is when people start building measure tables and there's like 30 measures in a table. Nothing's organized. It's all a big rat's nest.
Yeah.
And then every time I click on a measure, I'm having to go through, like, look at the click on each measure to see what is it calculating. There's no descriptions. There's no reference. There's no other documentation to it. So I think, just by throwing everything in a single table, calling it a measure table and calling it done, I think it's confusing to people, honestly. And that's why I don't use it anymore. I think it adds too much confusion to the pattern.
So what are you advocating for here, Tommy? You're advocating for a distinct measure table that has as many display folders underneath it
No.
as possible.
I'm advocating for using display folders to organize based on what facts it's in, and honestly, not using measure tables at all. I
Oh,
was going
okay.
to, I think,
I
at the beginning of
thought
the
you were on the
conversation.
complete opposite
No,
end
no,
of
no,
that.
no, 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 no. At the beginning of this conversation, I was like, I think I'm going to go back to measure tables. As this discussion has continued, I don't think measure tables are worth that whatever benefit it has.
I agree with you. I think again, I'll go back to the tool has been changing and it's been making it easier. What I think my biggest gripe is what we should be doing with measures and tables and folders should be made a lot easier in the user interface.
Yeah.
And I guess my point here is if Microsoft makes it easier to work with folders in desktop on the appropriate pages where you build measures, then I feel like more people will use them and follow best practices. But because the friction is so high right now to be able to right click, make a measure folder, grab a whole bunch, like I would like to grab a whole bunch of measures and just right click them and say move to folder.
In the
That should
report view.
in the report view. That should happen. So because there's so much extra friction, unless you're a advanced developer like Tabular Editor 3, where you can automate a script, which honestly, I love. The idea that I can say, grab these columns that are all numerical values and say, right click, make measure from the script, or right click, use a script. It will then grab all those columns, make them the sum of that column name as a title, put them in a folder, and then have the folder automatically made inside that table. To me, that's the incredible efficiency around what Tabular Editor 3 does. That's what desktop should be doing. It should be doing something as simple as that. Click columns, right click, sum, and it should just stick them all in a folder, drop them all in there, and then just have them sum of column name. Boom, done. Like, I don't know why. I don't know why we're looking at everyone's like, oh, DAX is hard. Yeah, it's hard, but it's also like Microsoft's not making it any easier for us to build stuff inside the model.
But Mike, everything we're saying is Tabular Editor 3. Like, does the tool dictate then which method you go? Because if you didn't have Tabular Editor or Tabular Editor 3, would display folder still be the precedent based on the actual effort to put in?
Tabular Editor doesn't define this. I think the fact that you don't see more models today with folders in them is purely a function of the desktop program does not make it easy for you to make a folder.
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
And prior to just a little bit ago, right?
You couldn't even make a folder.
Right. So
yeah.
Well, the point is like, would we be arguing differently for measure tables because it's just as painful to get it into a display folder because you have to switch window views in a new UI every single time you wanted to add one.
Correct.
However, the difference being like you could select multiple, right, and throw them into a display folder at the same time.
Yeah,
you'd still have to go through that experience. So I 100% agree with you. Like, if our conversations with most folks around Power BI end at, show me where the bar chart is, and add that to the visual pane, like it's no wonder you're not getting usage in there because it's not very useful.
Right.
But I do think you bring up another good point, which is another push in the direction of display folders is there's third-party tools that allow you now to make that an easier experience when you're developing things and injecting them into the desktop tool. So there's a use case to say, well, regardless of where you're creating and building things, there's a standardization between these two, tools that get them into the same place in the same way.
We're talking about, Seth, I completely agree. We're talking about a tool here that increases your productivity by a factor of 8, 10, right?
Yeah,
using
a lot. And a factor of a lot.
Right. But trying to create measure tables or trying to do display folders in desktop alone, 8 out of 10 times
Minimal.
It's easier to do a measure table.
I would agree.
So
it's
we can say all day long, display folders, but trying to organize that as you're building your model and just desktop, that is incredibly frustrating and hard to manage. So I guess that's my question. Would you recommend one approach or the other if someone did not have this third-party tool to do? Where measure tables do have more of a purpose for someone who's building everything in a model, but they can only use the desktop tool, the normal tool.
Measure tables are dead to me at this point. Like I understand your point.
You're dead to me.
You're dead to me.
Get out of here. When did that happen, Mike?
to
Let's
me-
talk
when
about
did
that.
that happen?
Seems like a pretty drastic decision that was just made. Like you didn't
know.
lead with that. Are you
No.
okay?
Yeah.
You need
No,
you need a hug?
I've
Oh,
pretty
okay.
Fuck
I've
amongst
pretty much
yourselves.
I think
dead to me.
again,
You're dead to me.
it was good when it was like when I had no folders.
It's like a bad relationship.
to me, it was like
Yeah.
yeah. To me the model, the design of a model has changed, right? It has been it has adapted over time, right? I feel like when desktop physically limited the ability for us to do this kind of stuff, and there was no table there, like yeah, I was all for measure tables, but now I have folders, and I feel like the folders is way better. So yeah,
Mike's a folder guy.
I'm
Tommy,
a 100% a
breaking
folder
up
guy.
with the measure table as well.
No,
I don't build any models with measure tables anymore.
like I said, we were testing things out with measure tables in a demo, but I think I'm the same way right now, where I really wouldn't recommend a measure table in not a lot of circumstances, as much as I want to. Like, and I feel like part of the logic still makes a lot of sense, like because you're always going to use a measure, right? You're always going to use
You
the
should
measure and
you should use measures. That
No,
doesn't
no,
even
you
happen all the
will
time either.
always will, yeah. If you
I mean,
listen to this podcast, you're
yeah,
always
right.
using measures.
Well, this podcast is called Explosive Measures, period. Like you should be using them like
Yeah.
bar none. Like that should be out there. So like I would also argue too, one of my other practices that I use in these tables is I go through any column that has a numerical value, I make it don't do any auto summarization. I'd almost even argue that you would even turn the flag on in the model and say discourage use of implicit measures, period. I think it's just, I mean, I would maybe even go that far and say I'm almost at that point. But I think the reason I'm having that stance is because I'm getting more familiar with advanced tooling that helps me manipulate the model so much faster, right? So I can make those really strong decisions that say no measure tables, correct star schema because I control the data engineering upstream. I have the ability to kind of push a little bit harder into best practices, and then I use Tabular Editor to make tons of measures super fast in folders with names and descriptions, like all following best practices right up front. So to me, I'm like looking at it going, if I can do all this stuff faster than I could in desktop, yeah, use those extra tools.
But again, that's maybe 10% of all developers who use Power BI, and I think that's a very liberal estimate there, that are using Tabular Editor or a tool like it every time they build a model. And so we can't rely on, we may have the recommendation of like, of course, display folders make sense when we're using Tabular Editor because it's literally an extra click.
But is that our fault or is that Microsoft's fault? Like to
Doesn't
me,
matter. That's yeah.
I would say, like, I would argue, right, to your point there, like, okay, we can't, I do agree with you. We don't expect everyone to be like a Tabular Editor expert, nor do I expect you to go buy Tabular Editor 3, like the premium edition, so you could use it on every model. I don't expect you to do that. However, what I'm saying is the models that I build will be easier to consume, will be easier to understand, and I'm using tooling to help my model building make it easier for end consumers to consume that data or those data models. That's because I'm using the advanced tools. I think it's a failure of Microsoft to not make it as easy as Tabular Editor 3 to edit and modify their models. And if they want more people to adopt good standards or best practices, Microsoft, you could do this. Go through the model and just say, here's all the columns that have numbers on them. What do you want to do to them? And you just have it like an initial step that builds out a ton of measures all up front, or auto build stuff for you in the model that just makes it work. I think that's the right solution.
Though, is that's not the that is not the real world that we live in right now.
Again,
like, and for most
regardless, like I don't care. Like I can have an idealistic worldview of like how this thing should work.
I already have Tabular Editor. I'm good.
Exactly. Not my problem. I have Tabular Editor.
Such an elitist view, Mike.
I don't know. But I mean, I think again, I'm poo-pooing these ideas because I think I've seen a better way of doing it, and I feel like for me, this process works really well. You can adopt my process, or you cannot. You can do your own thing. That's totally fine. But I feel like if Microsoft wants more people to adopt these types of processes, you've just got to make it easier in desktop. So to me, again, they're a limited team. They don't have unlimited people or unlimited resources to build this tool. So they're making decisions building the next best thing in the program. That is the next best thing in the program based on usage. Is the next best thing really going deep on folders and making it super easy for you to edit and make models? I probably would argue that's probably lower on their priority list because there are external tools.
But this is okay. So 100%, I agree with you, right? But this is the cycle of nonsense. Not it's a.
I'm sorry, I am the cycle of nonsense.
No. I'm trying to find the right word. I'm trying to find the right word because you and I know that like a lot of the decisions of what gets worked on is usage based, right? But you don't put things in an environment in such a way that people know or are aware that it's they can use it, right?
Yes.
And this is one of those things that would never come up on the radar as far as like, we should really invest in like making this easier because it's so difficult to find how you build any of this, right? Both of these options are not something the lay user is going to just stumble into and be like, this is where I'm going to put my measures because that makes a lot of sense. Right? You're not going to get usage unless you put it in a place that people know it's there.
Right.
It's like,
agreed.
So that's where it's like this cyclical argument of like, we're only going to work on things that people are using.
Yeah.
It doesn't work with all features of the platform at all.
And so that also means like some PM at Microsoft side has to be like, this is the right way. This will make people's life easier. I'm going to push for this. And there's a political game that's probably being played inside Microsoft at some level to say this feature, even though it's not using or a new feature, you have to justify every new feature you're building. You don't just be like, I'm going to put a smiley face inside Power BI because I want to. Like they're going to be like, nope, that's not a good feature. Like they just say, what's the use case? So they're going to push for like, what is the use case? What's the value add there? And I think what I feel like I'm seeing is where Microsoft's investing their time is they invest their time on where they think or the leaders that be think these are the best places to put investment around Power BI. That's where we'll spend our time. It's not going to be around these what the technical experts are saying are best practices.
Well, if we're going to speculate,
but not even that though. Like if you think about like the one point I do want to make here though is like, do you want to like push out into the forefront a right-click folder create when it breaks Excel to some degree because this is the business tool, right?
Display folders don't break Excel.
It's the measure table.
It's the measure table that does.
That's what I'm saying. Like one over the other.
Yeah.
Even another reason to use display folders in effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See?
Get rid of the other one.
Exactly.
My take is they don't want everything to be too easy. They want to see who's a really good developer and who's going to take the time to create display folders or figure it out. Don't make everything easy.
Yeah,
you got to keep something for us. For us guys that are just like buried in the tool every day.
Exactly. So I guess we're all on the same page, at least that measure tables they're dead to me. Would be the as Mike DiCarlo said. So, but like, are we all? I think it's not so much a personal preference. Then this really should be a best practice. Would we elevate the display folders?
Oh man, now you're really pushing on some. You're going to push some nerves on this one.
Well,
I wouldn't say best practice. What I would say is this: I think even in the conversation today and the other tooling and things that work better with display folders, that the propensity should be to probably use display folders over measure tables where you have, like an option. Are there going to be use cases specifically where a measure table may make sense or make more sense? Sure. But I would say as things have evolved, I would agree with the statement that display folders I find much more useful. I use them a lot more. Mm-hmm. And in general, maintaining consistency, it makes documentation easier, makes handing off models easier. And if I'm gonna put my hat on one of these that I use a lot more than the other, it's display folders.
I would agree with that one. It would be I think I would say, Tommy, I don't want to go so bold and be like it's a best practice. I don't think I would go that far because I think I still think there's a lot of people who like to use measure tables as themselves, and I think that's okay. Again, I think to kind of err on what Greg Baldini was saying earlier in the podcast, he was like, it's kind of a preference, right? It's an organization thing on how your mind works, how you organize things. What I will point out though is I think organizations should align on important data sets. And this is something that we've been doing a lot with companies right now, is talking through like, where does your data live and how does your data organizational structure fit? Like there's this presentation from Matthew Roach that has a really great little pyramid diagram, right? There's less data sets, there's less models at the top at the enterprise level that are being managed by the enterprise. And then as you widen the pyramid out, the base of the pyramid is like personal reporting, right? I'm just going to build a simple little Power BI file. I'm going to build some reports just for me. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to share it with anyone, right? So you have this scale, the spectrum from there's going to be a lot of content created for the individual user or a couple users, and then you're going to go all the way up to the enterprise level reporting, which is these are reports we're going to rely on for the entire enterprise. I think what I would say is if you're on the end of the spectrum when we're talking about personal reporting, fine. Build a measure table, build folders or not, organize or not, don't really care, right? You're just trying to experiment with things. The whole goal at that end is go fast and find value. I'm not going to give you very hard requirements around that. But however, as I move towards the enterprise side of things, the enterprise models, to me, that's where I'm going to put more rigor around. Does this make sense? Is it clear? Am I doing the right shaping of data? Is it a proper star schema? Because the further you go towards a managed or enterprise model, the more rigor that needs to be around the design and the planning of that model, which again, if you get to that end, you want those models to work well. You want them to be performant, right? That's just part of the story. So I guess I would say it's not a best practice, but I would say the further you move yourself towards enterprise grade modeling, that's when you're going to want to really align on what does your company stand for, and what are your standards by which makes a good model for you, and then you use those as your guidelines. And then anything that goes past that, this is going to be a cross departmental, this is going to be an enterprise report, this is going to go to executives or VPs because we got to have multiple people working on the model or report pages. Yeah, this is our standard. We're going to do this. And then you spend the extra effort to make that clean. Does that make sense?
No,
No, it does, and I absolutely agree with that. But like the addition to that is, if you're in an enterprise model, like this is highly curated. This is
Yes.
many conversations and or standards are created around data.
Yes.
So how you're naming things and the structure of your model and the data should align to the business. It should be like in that use case.
Yes.
It does it like. A display folder in a fact table doesn't matter from the standpoint that it's like, we're talking about these things. This is where like the model represents this business unit and
Yes.
where you're going to find sales, and like,
100%.
this is how we name things, and it just makes sense. Like that's highly curated.
Yes.
Right. On the other side of this is like on the day to day, I think ultimately it's ease of use. Like whatever is easier to use. I think we've described like the many different the display folders have a lot more avenues to be the same successful way in which, if you're confused, start there, right? Hide columns, use display folders in your fact table, and then at like what I would say is at the end of the day, when you share these models, whether it's highly curated or on the bottom, they're there to help a person understand organization. But if you teach people the search functionality, it doesn't really matter where the measure is. They can go find it. Right? Like go find the measure. Where does it actually live? It's going to be in this display folder, blah, blah, blah. Go check the DAX.
Yep.
So 2 strong points there. One, I never use a search from the formatting.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why. Whether it's looking for finding something on the formatting.
Search on formatting.
Both of them. Never use search.
I use search in columns all the time right now.
Search on columns.
Search on columns is a like if you don't use, that's a gold mine of a feature right there. Being able to type in a part of a word.
Forcing myself to understand the model. I don't know why. But
Tommy.
That is a best practice.
Learn the search.
Okay. Like that's the best practice.
Tommy, click, scroll.
Yeah, I will say this: of the features that I like right now, the expand all option in desktop to expand all properties in the properties window is a value added property for me. Like I use that one a lot of times. But I don't search for properties probably as much as I should, and I don't know why.
I think this is another podcast, the search functionality.
Oh no, yes,
So,
you're probably right on that one.
Before we jump into that, my last
Let's do wrap up thoughts because we're running out of time anyways.
Yeah, I think there's an idea, Mike, that you were proposing as we can all agree that self-service is going to become more and more of a factor here.
Yes.
And I think the sake of how we're building our models for ourselves, but thinking about someone to live connect to this, if we have the gold data set, then report what makes the most sense. And that organization is a series of conversations, not just here on a closing thought where we could talk about those best practices. I would say whatever the use case that you find, standardize it in terms of if you're going to do display folders, have your team do display folders so you can be in and out of different models quickly. If you're going to do measure tables, standardize that practice, not necessarily 18 or 25 measures in one table. The organization here and that flow for your team or yourself, keep it consistent.
I would agree with that one as well. I would say, again, my phrase here with this would be is look at where you're consuming data. Is the intent of this audience to be enterprise wide, very large global audience? I would say more rigor should be taken care of to make sure that model looks good, performs well, right? And so and again, I think we have to admit that the lower end spectrum of when you build Power BI reports, the same way with Excel files, right? There's like a couple of Excel files in your organization that are very highly quality because they need to be going to executives and it's repeating and it's very important data. There's a lot of other Excel files that are just for a single user. And so the same thing I think is going to happen with Power BI. And I think it's going to only accelerate faster when we can start looking at Power BI files inside OneDrive as well, or SharePoint. When we can just look at the file without actually loading it to PowerBI.com. It's just going to drive the usage through the roof. And so we have to be acceptable. We have to be comfortable with a whole lot of crap at the lower end or a whole lot of data being produced at the lowest end. And then figuring out how do we get the best stuff of those experiments, essentially, into regulated data sets that we distribute widely, because it will happen.
Yeah, I made my final thoughts, relevant to the topic. I think the only other thing that is a takeaway for me that I'm gonna relabel my do not use document for the team into "you dead to me," and we're just gonna put the things we're not gonna use in model building or bad practices into that folder.
Excellent. Well, with everyone, we thank you very much for your time. The chat has been super lively today, so I guess apparently people like it when we're actually here in person. So we'll try and keep that as much as possible. So thank you very much, chat. We really appreciate all your comments. It's been super good. If you want to join us live, you can find us. But our only ask here is just to make sure that if you like this episode, if this made some sense to you, if we thoroughly confused you on how to use measures and measure tables and all that kind of other fun stuff, please share it with someone else so you can share the confusion with them as well. They can also enjoy and argue at their podcast as well. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
There's a lot of places to do that. Your measure tables now are available the podcast. So so don't worry. So you can find the podcast on YouTube, LinkedIn Live, 7:30 in the morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Subscribe. We have the whole thing's on audio, so you can check it on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else podcasts are found.
Awesome. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.